You're listening to a man who built his career debunking ghost stories. Julian Croft had the tools, the training, the unshakable faith in science. But when he found those lead-lined journals buried beneath a century-old murder cabin, everything changed. The question isn't whether the supernatural exists. The question is, what do you do when you discover some truths are too dangerous to tell? This is the story of a skeptic who found proof and chose to bury it forever. The Kansas Highway was a ruler straight line drawn across a canvas of bleached yellow and pale blue. It was a place of oppressive sameness, where the heat shimmering off the asphalt was the only thing that seemed to move. Inside the climate-controlled bubble of his SUV, Julian Croft was oblivious to the landscape. The world outside was muted, filtered through tinted glass, and the expensive hum of his noise-cancelling headphones. He was listening to his own voice, a practiced, confident baritone that was the foundation of his career. Oh, and so the whispering woman of Grey Malkin Bridge, his recorded voice said, dripping with finality, proves to be nothing more than a combination of wind travelling through a poorly maintained truss structure and the power of suggestion. Eyewitness accounts contradict each other on every key detail, from the colour of her dress to the era of her supposed haunting. There is no body, no verifiable death on that bridge matching the legend. There is only a story, repeated until it felt true. Julian paused the playback. He tapped at his laptop, which was mounted securely to the passenger seat. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Conclusion: mass hysteria fueled by confirmation bias. No verifiable evidence. He read the words and nodded, a small, self-satisfied smile touching his lips. It was his mantra: no verifiable evidence. That was the rock upon which he had built his podcast, The Forensic Record. In a world drowning in cheap ghost stories and manufactured mysteries, Julian was an island of rationality. He didn't just tell stories, he solved them. He dismantled them piece by piece, exposing the flimsy framework of folklore and replacing it with the steel girder of fact. The back of his vehicle was a testament to this philosophy, packed not with ghost-hunting gadgets, but with the tools of an archaeologist and a sound engineer, ground-penetrating radar, professional-grade audio recorders, shovels, trowels, and sealed evidence containers. He was a man who believed that any ghost could be exorcised by a properly executed sound frequency analysis, any curse lifted by a thorough soil sample. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from his travel mug and started the audio again, letting his own voice fill the car's cabin as the endless road spooled out before him. He was heading toward the biggest, most infamous ghost story in the state, and he couldn't wait to tear it apart. The GPS declared his arrival with an impersonal chime, and Julian slowed the SUV to a crawl. The property was even more desolate than the photos suggested. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt erased, as if the landscape itself were trying to forget what had happened here. A single skeletal cabin stood silhouetted against the enormous empty sky, its wood weathered to a silver grey. The prairie grass, long and yellowed, swayed in a wind that did nothing to relieve the heat. Julian killed the engine. The sudden silence was immense, a physical pressure on his ears. He got out, his expensive hiking boots crunching on the dry, gravelly soil. He pulled out his phone, already filming, already performing for the audience he knew was waiting for this. "All right, everyone," he began, his voice a familiar, friendly beacon in the oppressive quiet. "Here we are, the infamous Bender property. For those of you new to the case, this is where, between 1871 and 1873, the Bender family, John Sr., Elspeth, John Jr., and Kate, are believed to have murdered at least a dozen travelers before vanishing without a trace." He panned the phone's camera across the dilapidated cabin. the overgrown fields that were once an apple orchard, the vast emptiness beyond. The legends are, of course, everywhere. Tales of Kate Bender being a psychic, a faith healer who communed with spirits. Stories of strange lights and whispers in the orchard. The official narrative is much more mundane and far more brutal. The Benders were grifters. They ran a small inn from this very cabin, and when a traveller with a bit of money came through, he would be seated at the head of the table, his back to a large canvas curtain. From behind that curtain, one of the Bender men would strike him in the head with a hammer. The body would be dropped through a trapdoor into the cellar, stripped of its valuables, and later buried in the orchard. He stopped walking, letting the silence hang for a moment. It is a gruesome story, a perfect example of frontier brutality. But over the last century and a half, it has become something else, a ghost story. My goal here, for the next few weeks, is to cut through that folklore. We are going to separate the facts from the fiction, and it starts inside. The air in the cabin was thick with the dust of 150 years. It was still hot and smelled of dry rot and something vaguely unsettling, like old bones. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the gloom. It was larger than it looked from the outside, a single large room that served as kitchen, parlour, and, for its victims, an execution chamber. In the centre of the floor were the dark outlines of a trapdoor. Julian didn't waste time. He worked with a methodical efficiency that was almost ritualistic. He unpacked his gear, turning a corner of the haunted space into a clean, modern production studio. Laptops hummed to life, their screens casting a cool blue light on the rough-hewn wooden walls. He set up LED work lights, banishing the natural shadows with a harsh, analytical glare. He positioned microphones on stands, ready to capture every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind. He was imposing his order, his scientific grid, onto this place of chaos and myth. He set up his primary camera on a tripod, framing the trapdoor. He clipped a small lavalier microphone to his shirt and addressed the lens. "The heart of the Bender legend is the cellar," he said, his voice now crisp and professional. "It's where the initial act of violence was completed. It has been excavated before, of course, back in 1873, when the crimes were first discovered. But those were rudimentary digs. My plan is to conduct a full modern archaeological survey. We'll use GPR to check for soil disturbances, and we will excavate grid by grid to see if there's anything a button, a coin, a personal effect that the original investigators might have missed. We're going to map this space with scientific precision and, in the process, hopefully put some of the more imaginative theories to rest for good." He gave a slight confident smile, then walked over, and with a grunt of effort, heaved the ancient trapdoor open, revealing a square of perfect, subterranean blackness. The cellar was a cramped earthen tomb, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and decay. The harsh, white light of Julian's work lamps created sharp, unforgiving shadows, turning the small space into a sterile operating theatre. He had been down here for hours, working with the painstaking patience of a surgeon. A grid of string was laid out across the floor, dividing the ground into neat, metre-long squares. He was working on square C4, a section near the back wall that the original reports had noted was unusually compacted. He scraped at the dirt with a small trowel, documenting every layer, every small stone. It was tedious, sweat-soaked work. His knees ached, and his shirt was plastered to his back. This was the unglamorous reality of his job, the part his listeners rarely appreciated: the long, boring hours of manual labour required to find one small, hard piece of truth. Then his shovel struck something. It wasn't the sharp clink of hitting rock, It was a dull, low thud, a dead sound, heavy and final. Julian froze. His heart, which had been beating in a slow, steady rhythm, gave a sudden, hard kick against his ribs. He put down the shovel and knelt, his hands working carefully now, brushing the loose dirt away. The object was dark, rectangular, metal. He dug faster. His breath held tight in his chest. Excitement, hot and electric, coursed through him. This was it. This was the moment he lived for the discovery. The piece of verifiable evidence that changes the story. He finally cleared the last of the dirt away. It was a box, about the size of a shoebox, but its appearance sent a jolt of confusion through him. It was made of a dark, heavy metal that seemed to absorb the light. There were no seams, no hinges, no visible lock. It looked less like it was constructed and more like it was cast, a solid, seamless object. The surface was pitted and corroded, but what was truly strange was the material itself. It had the dull, heavy look of lead. He ran his fingers over the surface. It was cold, unnaturally so. Who would bury a lead-lined box in the cellar of a murder cabin? Lead was for shielding, for containment. It was for keeping things in or for keeping things out. This object didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't a strong box for stolen money. The Benders were known to have fled with their cash. It wasn't a personal effect of a victim. It was something else. An anomaly, an object that had no place in the official record. For the first time since arriving, Julian Croft felt a genuine, unfamiliar chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cellar. He looked at the impossible box, then up at the square of light from the open trapdoor, and realized the oppressive Kansas silence had finally been filled with a question he had no immediate, rational answer for. The heavy lead box sat on the rough-hewn table under the sterile glare of the LED lights, a dark, silent question mark in the center of Julian S.'s meticulously ordered world. He had his camera rolling, capturing the moment for his podcast, but his usual confident narration had evaporated. He worked with a focused intensity, his tools laid out beside the box like surgical instruments, a pry bar, a cold chisel, a heavy-duty hammer. There was no lock to pick, no hinges to force. He had to break it. He found a slight indentation along one edge, a potential flaw in the ancient casting, and set the tip of the chisel against it. The first blow from the hammer rang out, a sharp, discordant clang that echoed unnaturally in the small cabin. The lead was soft, malleable, and it dented under the impact. He struck it again and again, the rhythmic, percussive sounds a stark contrast to the thick silence of the Kansas prairie. Finally, with a low groan of tortured metal, a fissure appeared. He jammed the pry bar into the opening and threw his full weight against it. The seal broke with a sigh, a faint puff of stale, musty air escaping its century-and-a-half-long imprisonment. Julian peered inside. His initial feeling was one of disappointment. There was no gold, no hidden treasure, just fabric. A dark, rotted material that crumbled to dust at his touch. But beneath it, there was something else. He reached in carefully and lifted out the first object. It was a leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained, but miraculously intact. He set it down and reached in again. There was another, and another. In total, there were 3 journals, all of them preserved in the strange, airless environment of the lead box. He opened the first one. The paper was brittle, the color of old ivory. The handwriting was a strange, spidery script, written in faded brown ink. It was dense, cramped, and difficult to read. And then there was the smell. It was more than just the musty scent of old paper. There was something else beneath it, something metallic and faintly, deeply unpleasant, like old blood, like spoiled meat. Julian leaned back, a wave of professional excitement washing over his initial unease. He looked directly into the camera lens, his showman-esque smile returning. "Well, it seems we have our answer," he said, his voice resonating with theatrical discovery. "It appears the Benders were not only killers, but writers. This is a gold mine, a direct window into the minds of the perpetrators." He gestured to the journals with a sweep of his hand. "This is it, folks, the delusional manifesto of the Bender clan." Hours bled into one another. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world outside the cabin into an inky star-dusted blackness. But Julian didn't notice. He was in his element, a man deciphering a lost language. He had set up his high-resolution scanner, and a laptop was tethered to it, capturing each fragile page as a pristine digital file. He worked with the reverence of a museum archivist, carefully turning each page, his face illuminated by the cool glow of the screen. He began reading from the first entry, his voice a low murmur in the quiet cabin, as he translated the spidery script aloud. The first journal, it seemed, belonged to Elsbeth Bender. October 12th, 1871, Julian read. "A man arrived today from the east. A cellar of notions, his wagon full of trifles. His body was weary from the road, but his memories were vibrant. They shone from him like heat from a blacksmith's forge. A life of cities, of crowds, of noise. A sour marriage, a daughter he missed dearly. All of it, a rich tapestry." Julian paused, frowning at the strange turn of phrase. Vibrant memories. He shook his head, a small, condescending scoff escaping his lips. Theatrical, even for the time. He continued reading. "We offered him supper. Kate spoke to him of the spirits, and he laughed at her. But his soul was bitter with doubt, and that bitterness made his memories sharp. A good vintage. He took the seat of honor. Father was ready behind the canvas. The harvest will be tonight. We must not let such a strong vintage fade." Julian stopped again. He rubbed his eyes, the strange allegorical language starting to grate on him. It was a bizarre, almost poetic description of a planned murder. Harvest, vintage. It was the language of a religious fanatic, someone who had dressed up their base, brutal crimes in the robes of high ceremony. He made a note on his laptop. Language analysis. Heavy use of metaphor, likely tied to extremist religious beliefs. Possible influence from European folk traditions. He was categorizing it, containing it, building a neat, rational fence around the madness. It was just a text, a historical artifact. It had no power. He was about to start scanning the next page when a sound from outside ripped through the silence of the cabin, a loud, sharp crack. The definitive, unmistakable sound of a heavy tree branch snapping. Julian shot to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had been close. Too close. He instantly grabbed the most powerful flashlight he owned, a tactical beam that could cut through a quarter-mile of darkness, and his night vision camera. He burst out of the cabin door, his city-bred instincts screaming that he wasn't alone. He swept the beam of light across the tree line, a brilliant white cone slicing through the absolute black. The gnarled shapes of the trees stood stark and silent. Nothing. He scanned left, then right. The prairie grass swayed in the night breeze. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void was heavier now, more profound. It felt like it was listening. He raised the night vision camera to his eye. The world resolved into a ghostly landscape of greens and blacks. He could see the heat signatures of a few rabbits huddled in the grass, the faint warmth of a field mouse scurrying near the cabin's foundation. He scanned the tree line again, slowly, methodically. Nothing. No deer, no coyote, no human-shaped glow. Just the cold, indifferent woods. He lowered the camera, his breath misting in the cool night air. His logical mind told him exactly what had happened. An old branch, weakened by age or rot, had finally given way. It was a common occurrence in any wooded area. But another part of him, a primal, irrational instinct he loathed, was screaming that the sound had been intentional. It had been a footstep, a warning. He felt 1,000 unseen eyes on him from the darkness of the trees. He stood there for a long moment, a man armed with the pinnacle of modern technology, feeling utterly, terrifyingly exposed. He quickly retreated back into the cabin, the heavy wooden door booming shut behind him, the bolts sliding home with a loud, definitive click. Sleep was impossible. The sound of the snapping branch and the crushing silence that followed played on a loop in his mind. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind against the walls sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a scientist, a rationalist, and he was acting like the terrified subject of one of his own debunked ghost stories. Annoyed with himself, he turned back to the only thing that felt solid, the only thing he could analyze: the journals. He set aside Elsbeth's flowery metaphorical prose and picked up the second volume. The handwriting was different, sharper, more aggressive. The title page read, "The Accounts of John Bender Jr." Julian leaned forward, his weariness replaced by a grim fascination. He skipped ahead, looking for something that would cut through the allegory. He found it. The entry was dated a few days after Elsbeth's description of the traveller. The language here was not poetic, it was instructional. It was a recipe. Julian began to read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. The severing must be done at the base of the skull to preserve the vessel's core memory. The consumption is not of the flesh, for the flesh is merely the cask. It is the spirit, the timeline, that must be drawn out. It is a harvest, not a murder. We take their stories into ourselves to stave off the great forgetting, to keep the past alive inside us. Their years become our years, their knowledge, our knowledge. A wave of profound nausea washed over Julian. He felt the bile rise in his throat. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't religious delusion. This was a clear, concise, hideously lucid description of a ritual of cannibalism. Not for sustenance, but for something else. To absorb a person's life, their memories, to achieve some kind of horrific, parasitic immortality. He pushed his chair back from the table, his mind reeling. He looked around the cabin, at the shadows dancing in the corners, and for the first time, he felt a genuine, bone-deep fear. This wasn't just a case file. It wasn't just a story. He frantically opened his laptop and started a new audio file for his podcast, his fingers trembling as he typed out the title for the episode. The Benders, a case study in shared psychotic disorder. He had to frame it. He had to contain it. He had to find the scientific label for the madness, because the alternative that it was real was too monstrous to contemplate. The cold light of dawn did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere in the cabin. Julian hadn't slept. He'd spent the night trying to build a fortress of rationalism around the horrifying words he'd read in John Bender Jr.'s journal. Shared psychotic disorder, folie à deux. He repeated the clinical terms to himself, turning them over and over like smooth stones. They were a comfort, a shield. The Benders were a closed system, a family unit that had spun a web of madness around itself, reinforcing its own delusions until they became reality. The journals weren't a guide to the supernatural. They were a roadmap of insanity. To prove it, he needed to show their fantastical elements had no basis in the real world. He turned to his laptop, pulling up satellite images and old survey maps of the property. He cross-referenced them with the journals, specifically a strange hand-drawn map he'd found tucked into the back of Elsbeth's volume. It was crude, almost childish, showing the cabin, the orchard, and a path leading into the woods. A small X was marked on the map, with a few spidery words written next to it. The Weeping Stone by the Thirsty Well. The journal described this place as essential, a site of power for preparing the vessel before the harvest. To Julian, this was a perfect test case. If the location was pure fantasy, it would support his theory of delusion. If it was real, it would simply mean the Benders had a favourite picnic spot, which they then mythologized in their writings. Either way, it was data. He grabbed his camera, a field kit, and his audio recorder. He would treat the superstitious map as if it were a scientific document, follow its instructions to the letter, and debunk it with hard evidence. He was going to find this weeping stone, film it as B-roll for the podcast, and expose it as nothing more than a rock. The woods behind the Bender property were thick and tangled, a chaotic mess of thorny bushes and grasping vines. There was no trail. Julian had to force his way through the underbrush, the crude map from the journal clutched in his hand. He felt a ridiculous flicker of doubt, like a child on a treasure hunt, but he pushed it down. This was work. This was methodology. After nearly an hour of struggling through the dense foliage, he saw it. Through a clearing, there was a break in the earth, a circular depression lined with old, crumbling stones. A well. It was almost completely swallowed by the forest floor, choked with leaves and debris. But it was undeniably a well. And next to it, just as the map had indicated, sat a massive boulder. It was at least 6 feet high, a great grey monolith covered in a thick carpet of dark green moss. But the moss wasn't dry. It glistened with moisture, beads of water clinging to it like tiny jewels. Droplets trickled down the boulder's face, leaving dark streaks on the stone, as if the rock itself were weeping into the dry, thirsty earth. Julian stared, his mouth slightly agape. There had been no rain for weeks. He stepped closer, reaching out a hesitant hand to touch the stone. The surface was shockingly, unnaturally cold. It felt like touching a block of ice. As his fingers traced the damp surface, he felt something else, notches, grooves. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the moss-covered rock. There, almost invisible beneath the growth, were carvings. He pulled a trowel from his kit and began carefully scraping away the moss. His breath hitched. The symbols emerging on the stone were not random marks. They were precise, geometric, and utterly familiar. They were the same strange, spidery symbols he had seen scrawled in the margins of the Bender journals. The direct, one-to-one correlation was a punch to the gut. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mythologized landmark. This was a site, prepared and marked exactly as the journals had described. His carefully constructed theory of delusion was beginning to feel terrifyingly thin. He didn't leave. He couldn't tee. He was a scientist confronted with an anomaly, and his instinct, his entire being, was wired to observe, to document, to understand. Julian spent the next few hours at the site, a whirlwind of frantic activity. He took dozens of high-resolution photos of the well and the weeping stone. He made rubbings of the symbols. He set up his professional audio recorder on a small tripod, hoping to capture the strange acoustics of the clearing, the sound of the water dripping from the stone. As the sun began to set, the woods grew dark quickly. The air grew cold, and the clearing took on a strange, cathedral-like silence. Julian was packing up his gear when he heard it. It wasn't a sound that came through his ears, not a vibration in the air. It was a thought, planted fully formed in the center of his mind, a young woman's voice, humming a simple, hauntingly sad folk tune. He froze, spinning around, his eyes wide. The clearing was empty. There was no one there. The humming stopped, replaced by a single, crystal-clear whisper that resonated not in the air, but in the marrow of his bones. He said he had work in Colorado. The words slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. They were a direct quote. He had read them just last night. The last recorded words of a victim named Sarah, taken directly from Elsbeth Bender's journal. A purely animal terror, cold and absolute, seized him. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, and the expensive audio recorder tumbled from his grasp, landing with a soft thud on the mossy ground. He scrambled away from it, crawling backward like a crab, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the voice had been. He left his equipment where it lay, turned, and ran, crashing blindly through the woods. The sound of his own ragged, panicked breathing loud in his ears. He burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut and ramming the bolt home. His heart was a wild drum against his ribs. For a long moment, he just leaned against the door, gasping for air, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and terror. It was a hallucination. Auditory pareidolia, stress. The power of suggestion. He threw every rational explanation he could think of at the experience, but they all felt like paper shields against a hurricane. Then, a thought cut through the panic. The recorder he had been recording. The entire experience, the humming, the whisper it would be on the digital file. Proof, verifiable, empirical proof. He had run back out, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a desperate need to know. He just snatched the recorder from the ground and sprinted back to the cabin. Now, he sat at the table, his hands trembling as he plugged the recorder into his laptop. He pulled on his headphones, blocking out the world, isolating himself with the data. He found the file and scrubbed to the exact moment it happened. He closed his eyes and hit play. He heard the faint ambient sounds of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, his own breathing. He heard the moment he stumbled, the soft thud as the recorder hit the ground, but there was nothing else. No humming, no voice, no whisper. He ripped the headphones off. It couldn't be right. He cranked the audio gain on his laptop to maximum, pushing the levels into the red. He put the headphones back on, the hiss of the amplified static so loud it was painful. He listened again. Wind, his own panicked breathing, and static, only static. His technological proof, the foundation of his entire worldview, had utterly failed him. The thing he had experienced was real to him, but it had left no trace, no footprint in the empirical world. It existed in a place his science couldn't reach. He stared at the journals, spread across his table like sleeping vipers. They weren't a record of the past anymore. They weren't a map of madness. They were a live wire, and he had just grabbed hold of it with both hands. Days bled into one another, measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the turning of brittle, ink-stained pages. The Julian Croft who had arrived in Kansas full of confident skepticism was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted figure who moved through the dilapidated cabin like a ghost. The fortress of reason had fallen, and something else had taken root in its place. Obsession. The cabin was unrecognizable. The meticulous podcasting setup lay abandoned in a corner, gathering dust. The space had become a frantic, three-dimensional representation of a shattered mind. Every wall was a chaotic tapestry of paper. Printouts of journal pages were tacked up next to hand-drawn copies of the accursed symbols. Old maps were crisscrossed with frantic red lines connecting names to dates, victims to ritual sites. String ran from one note to another, a web of paranoid connections that only Julian could understand. He barely ate. He slept in fits and starts, often jolting awake from nightmares filled with whispers and the scent of damp earth. He muttered to himself constantly, piecing together fragments of the Bender's lore, not as a historian documenting the past, but as a prisoner, desperately trying to learn the rules of his cell. He had fully surrendered his scientific skepticism. The journals were no longer a subject of study. They were his only operating manual, his only guide through the encroaching darkness. One morning, fueled by a sleepless night and 3 cups of black coffee, he found a new map. It was tucked into the final pages of John Jr.'s journal, and it was different from the others. It was labeled not with ritual sites, but with a single chilling phrase: the Garden of Empty Vessels. Julian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was a map of the Bender's graveyard. The journal claimed the bodies were unimportant, mere husks to be discarded after the harvest. Julian's obsession demanded proof. He had to know. He had to see. He found the spot at the base of a gnarled ancient oak tree, whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. He dug with a frantic energy, not with the careful precision of an archaeologist, but with the desperate haste of a man digging for his own sanity. The shovel threw dirt in great plumes. He wasn't looking for data to analyze. He was looking for confirmation of the nightmare. His shovel hit something soft. Not bone, but fabric. He dropped to his knees, his hands scrabbling at the soil. He pulled out a rotting scrap of dark wool, the remnants of a 19th century dress, and beneath it, something small and hard. It was a silver locket, tarnished almost black with age and dirt. His fingers trembled as he worked at the delicate clasp. It sprang open. Inside, protected from the earth for over a century, was a faded sepia-toned photograph. A tintype of a young woman with a solemn face, her arm wrapped around a small child who stared directly at the camera with wide, innocent eyes. Julian turned the locket over. On the back, etched in a delicate, looping script, were 2 words: Eleanor Vance. The name shot through Julian like a bolt of lightning. He had read it just hours before: Eleanor Vance and her 4-year-old son, Peter. They were listed in the journal as the Bender's final victims before they vanished. This wasn't a story. This wasn't a delusion. This was Eleanor. This was her son. He was holding the last remnant of a life that had been harvested in this very spot. The discovery brought no clarity, no scientific satisfaction, only a fresh wave of terror that solidified his obsession into a cold, hard certainty. That night, the fear became something more than a historical echo or a whisper in his mind. It became a man. Julian was attempting to board up a broken window, the sound of his hammer echoing the Bender's own murderous work, when his phone buzzed. An alert from the motion-activated security camera he depositioned facing the woods. He swiped the screen open, his heart seizing in his chest. The live feed showed the edge of the property, the trees a ghostly green in the infrared light, and standing there, perfectly still, just at the tree line, was a figure. A tall, impossibly gaunt man, dressed in dark, simple clothes. He wasn't doing anything. He was just watching the cabin. His stillness was more terrifying than any threat. He was an owner, surveying his land. Julian fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. He glanced back at the screen of his security feed to give the operator a description, but the screen was empty. The man was gone. He had vanished back into the woods as silently as he had appeared. When the local sheriff finally arrived, He was the picture of weary condescension. He swept his flashlight beam across the tree line, found nothing, and treated Julian like a paranoid city dweller spooked by shadows. "Probably just a local taking a shortcut, son," the sheriff said, a dismissive tone in his voice. "Or maybe you've been reading too many of your own stories." As the cruiser's red and blue lights disappeared down the dirt road, Julian was left with a crushing realization. His technology had worked perfectly, but the systems of authority had failed him. He was completely, utterly alone. He didn't sleep in the cabin that night. He couldn't. He locked the doors, grabbed a blanket, and retreated to the steel and glass safety of his SUV, parking it so it faced the front door of the cabin. He eventually drifted into a shallow, dream-haunted sleep, the silver locket clutched tight in his hand. He awoke with a start to the first light of dawn. He sat up, his body stiff and sore, and looked toward the cabin. Something was wrong. A small glint of light on the dark wood of the front door, where there had been nothing before. He got out of the car, his movements stiff, and walked slowly toward the cabin, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. Tacked to the center of the door was a single, freshly plucked raven's feather, its blackness a stark contrast to the weathered grey wood. It was held in place by a crudely sharpened piece of bone that had been driven into the door like a nail. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. His blood ran cold. He recognized it instantly, a feather and a sharpened bone. He had seen the symbol drawn in the margins of the journals countless times. It was a marker, a warning, a claim of ownership. The threat was no longer a passive watcher in the woods. It was a direct, ritualistic communication. The man from the forest had walked right up to his door, leaving a message written in a language of pure superstition. A language Julian now understood all too well. It said, "I know you are here. I know what you have found. And this place is mine." The raven's feather on the door was not just a warning, it was an appointment. Julian knew he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. He spent the day not in frantic fear, but in grim preparation. He was a cornered animal, but he had read the zookeeper's manual. That night, he didn't hide. He sat at the table in the center of the cabin, the 3 journals laid out before him, the silver locket resting on top of them. He waited. Just after midnight, the cabin door creaked open. Silas stood in the doorway, a tall, gaunt silhouette against the moonlit prairie. He stepped inside and closed the door softly behind him. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly. His movements were calm, deliberate, almost academic. He looked at the chaos of notes on the wall, a flicker of distaste crossing his features, before his eyes settled on Julian. "You have been busy," Silas said, his voice a low, even baritone, devoid of any obvious threat. "Making quite a mess of my ancestral home." He walked closer, his eyes fixed on the journals. "Those do not belong to you," he stated, as if discussing a property dispute. "You are a grave robber, a child playing with relics you cannot possibly comprehend." Julian S. heart hammered in his chest, but his voice was steady. "The Benders were murderers, psychopaths." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That is the story you tell yourself, the simple, comfortable narrative that fits your tiny, modern worldview. You think it was about money, about crude immortality? The Benders. My family were not a single entity. They were one cell, one small part of a society dedicated to a sacred purpose, to safeguard knowledge." He gestured around the room. "Memories fade. Experiences are lost to time like tears in the rain. We are librarians of the human condition. We don't steal lives. We preserve them. We absorb the timelines of those who would otherwise be forgotten, ensuring their most potent moments, their greatest joys and deepest sorrows, are not lost to the great forgetting." He looked at Julian with an air of profound condescension. What you call a harvest, what you see as a monstrous act, is a sacred duty. Now, return my property. Your part in this is over. No, Julian said, his voice quiet but firm. Silas's calm expression tightened, the first crack in his serene facade. Julian had read every page, every annotation, every hidden passage in the back of the final journal. He had found the failsafe. The Benders were arrogant, Julian continued, his confidence growing. They believed their focus was absolute, but they had a weakness, a flaw in the design. He had spent the entire day preparing for this. His podcasting equipment, once the tools of a rationalist, was now rigged as a weapon of superstition. His laptop was open, a single audio file ready to play. They called it dissonance, a sound that shatters the connection, a frequency that breaks the vessel. Before Silas could react, Julian slammed his finger down on the spacebar. It was not a loud sound, but it was agonizing. A high-frequency, deeply unpleasant tone screeched from the multiple speakers Julian had positioned around the cabin. It was a piercing, razor-thin shriek that vibrated in the air, in the teeth, in the bones. To Julian, it was merely painful, a dentist's drill in his ears. To Silas, it was annihilation. His calm demeanor shattered instantly. He screamed, a raw, inhuman sound of pure agony, and clutched his head, his fingers digging into his temples, his body contorted, his academic posture collapsing into a writhing knot of pain. The sound was tailored to a specific weakness, a vulnerability of those who had performed the ritual, a key Julian had found in their own writings. He was weaponizing audio engineering, using the science of frequencies to enact a counter-ritual. The knowledge of superstition was the bullet, the technology of science was the gun. Silas stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and disbelief, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling under a sonic assault he could never have anticipated. Silas, disoriented and weakened, his ears bleeding, scrambled for the door. He threw it open and stumbled out into the darkness, his screams fading as he disappeared into the night. As the cabin door swung shut, Julian stabbed the spacebar again, and the piercing tone died. Silence. But it was a different silence than before. The oppressive, watchful pressure that had permeated the cabin since he'd arrived was gone. The air felt light, clean. The silence was now peaceful, empty. Julian sat in the center of the room, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline, breathing heavily. The journals lay open on the table. He had won. He had faced the monster and survived. He held the single greatest, most terrifying true crime story ever told, a story that would make him a legend. But as he looked at the silver locket resting on the brittle pages, the face of Eleanor Vance staring up at him, his victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could never share it. To tell the world would be to unleash the journals, to validate Silas's society, to put a target on his own back forever. The truth was too dangerous to be told. Months later, the Kansas prairie was a distant memory. Julian was in a clean, modern, but completely anonymous apartment in a city where no one knew his name. The locks on his door were heavy duty. The windows had security shutters. He looked older, more somber. The confident spark in his eyes had been replaced by a weary caution. His podcast, The Forensic Record, was defunct. The website was dark. His entire public persona had been erased. On a table before him sat the lead-lined box. He carefully took the 3 journals and the small silver locket and placed them inside. He paused, his hand hovering over the box. Then he gently closed the heavy lid, sealing the secrets within. He lifted the box and carried it to a large high-tech safe bolted to the floor in his closet. He placed the box inside, swung the heavy door shut, and turned the combination lock until it clicked. His quest had begun with a desire to expose a truth to the world. It ended with him becoming the sole guardian of a truth he had to hide from it forever. The elixir he had returned with from his journey into the special world was not fame or understanding, but a dangerous piece of knowledge. He had learned that some things are real but cannot be proven, that some doors are meant to remain closed. He had sacrificed his life's work, his voice, to become a silent keeper of the flame, ensuring the great forgetting, in its own way, would continue. There's something deeply compelling about watching a person Iz's entire worldview get shattered. We begin this story with Julian Croft, a man who lives by a simple, powerful mantra. If you can't prove it, it isn't real. His world is one of facts, data, and verifiable evidence. The Bender journals, at first, are just a new data set, a delusional manifesto, to be catalogued and explained away by psychology. But what makes this story so fascinating is that it isn't a simple case of science losing to superstition. It is far more complex. Julian doesn't abandon his scientific tools, he is forced to use them in a new way. He takes the forbidden knowledge from the journals, the idea of a sonic dissonance, and uses his modern audio equipment to turn it into a weapon. He uses the tools of science to enact a kind of magic. This forces us to look beyond a simple binary. The story suggests that maybe the most profound truths aren't found in choosing one worldview over another, but in the terrifying, chaotic space where they intersect. And in the end, Julian's reward for this discovery isn't fame or clarity, it's silence. He starts as a man who exposes truth to the world, and ends as a man who must hide a truth from it. He wins the battle, but is left with the burden of knowledge. It leaves me wondering about the nature of truth itself. If you discovered a truth that you believed was real, but that couldn't be proven, and might even be dangerous, what is your responsibility? Would you share it with the world? Or would you carry that secret alone? Let me know what you think in the comments.